This video is more than just another tutorial about how to use the Zeroscillator and the poly-Zeroscillator. Yes, I'm going to explain each and every detail of its functionality, and yes, I'm going to show a bunch of examples of how to use the Zeroscillator and his big brother, the poly-oscillator, the poly-Zeroscillator in patches. But I'm also going to explain the central technique of this module, frequency modulation and phase modulation in all its enigmatic aspects and variants. Well, phase modulation, rather not. Those of you who don't want these deeper insights and understanding of the matter of FM, well, don't worry. You can easily skip these more theoretic and basic parts because they'll have a colored marker at the bottom of the screen, and they are, of course, listed in the timeline. Well, let's go for it then. The Zeroscillator was designed as a hardware module by Mark Barton in 2005 and developed in cooperation with Cynthia Webster from Synth Industries. There is a nice story about it written in Cherry Audio's website. I'll put the link in the description. Cynthia made a very nice and interesting video about the hardware of Zeroscillator in 2011, and again I'll put the link to it down in the description. But last but not least, there is a video about voltage modular software Zeroscillator, and again the link is down in the description. A video made by the maker of this software clone himself, who is exactly that Mark Barton who made the hardware 16 years ago. Mark approaches the matter of through Zero FM, which is the central point here, of course, with the Zeroscillator, from wave shape kind of view, whereas I'm going to explain things rather from the spectral side, looking at the partials and their behavior. But after such a long introduction, it's time to make sound. Some sound at first. So I patched the Zeroscillator's outputs from sine to mod out, one after the other, into voltage modular's main audio out. Just to discover there's nothing special about these waves, and the mod out is even completely silent. Later more about the mod out jack. Zeroscillator's main job, but not its only job, is doing all sorts of FM frequency modulation. Let me patch another oscillator into one of the FM injects. I take exponential FM1 and see what happens when I crank the Attenuverter Proti up. Weak, very weak, a very weak kind of FM. Let me add the second exponential FM input to the game now. Well, a bit better, but still not exciting. But hey, wait a minute. What if I patched the modulating oscillator's output in the Zeroscillator's input more than only once? Well, let's try. Yes, that's it. Yeah, that's it. But have you noticed it? There was something strange going on while I turned the Attenuverter from plus to minus. The modulation vanished. Let me remove the multitude of cables and do again what I was doing when this happened. Well, I adjusted one poti to plus maximum and the other to minus maximum, and at both input jacks were the same signal, meaning our poor Zeroscillator's wave was torn up and down, or to the right and to the left, all with the same strength and at the same time. If I were the Zeroscillator, I would do what I did as a child, when Mum wanted me to tidy up my room, but Daddy wanted me to do homework first. I did nothing. And so does our Zeroscillator. Okay, a wise decision. But let's get serious about this, because this behavior opens up the gate to a whole bunch of interesting experiments. Have you ever asked yourself if equations like these make any sense at all? And if they do, which sense? What is the answer? Well, we can find out. Patching a saw wave into FM input 1 and turning the poti to plus maximum, and patching a sine wave into FM input 2 and turning the poti to minus maximum gives us the answer to all our questions. Sensational. Sensational. Let me try some of these equations now. May I lead your attention to the fact that the Zeroscillator and the green external modulating oscillator have been running at the same frequency so far? Let me change that. Only experimental and just for fun a bit at the moment. What a difference. Well, it's time for some explanations and a bit of theory before I can go further into the functions of the Zeroscillator. Gruesome theory and horror. So all small children who are too young to stand shocking theory horror, go for a slash, wash your hands, brush your teeth, go to bed, do your prayer, and sleep. And with the rest of the community, with you, dear adults, I want to fight the first part of theory now. Let's do away with the very basics at first. If we change the pitch of a note with less than about 16 hertz, the changing is less than about 16 hertz, we get a vibrato. The probably most famous situation to observe this effect is when the violinist makes this nervous vibrating movement with his finger on the place when pushing down the string. The frequency he lets his finger vibrate with is the modulating frequency, and the frequency which we hear as the pitch of the tone is the modulated frequency. We could truly say that most of the violinists, well, they are fairly proud of this ability to do frequency modulation. Well, sub-audio frequency modulation. Sub-audio because the vibrations of the finger are too slow, their frequency is too low to generate an audible tone, a pitch, or any kind of sonic effect themselves. Flies and bees can do better. They can do better with their wings, which vibrate fast enough to generate frequencies higher than 16 Hz. Audible frequencies, which we perceive as a typical humming sound. Would bees be better violinists, therefore? Okay, no, they wouldn't. They would not because of two reasons. First, they are, of course, too weak to hold a violin. Ha ha. Terrible, this Czech kind of humor, isn't it? Second, and that's serious again, if the frequency of the modulation is inaudible range itself, then strange things happen. The timbre of the tone changes. We get different sounds. That's always happening. And the overall pitch of the tone I'm playing changes as well. That's happening quite often, but not always. Let's leave the violins and the fleas and the bees and enter the field of electronic music. With synthesizers and modules, we don't need to overstrain our fingers to do audible rate frequency modulation, which is the, well, real frequency modulation. We can commit this task to transistors and capacitors and integrated circuits and so on, analog ones as well as digital ones, and gain a bunch of different kinds of frequency modulation this way. The most common kinds of frequency modulation are exponential frequency modulation, linear frequency modulation, linear through zero frequency modulation. Exponential through zero frequency modulation doesn't exist, cannot exist. The term exponential through zero FM is a contradiction in itself, as I will explain a bit later. And there is this so-called phase modulation as well. When we modulate the frequency or the phase of an oscillator, then additional partials occur in the spectrum, partials which, of course, change the timbre. I said it. These additional partials are called sidebands, a term which comes from early radio electronics, and they occur to both sides of the fundamental pitch. I'm using only sine waves to make things easier at the beginning. But which partials occur, and how many of them, and how strong are they? What is their amplitude? Well, which partials occur? That is simple mathematics. The first two sidebands occur at the fundamental plus the modulating frequency and the fundamental minus the modulating frequency. Then, when I increase the strength of the modulation, what is the amplitude of the modulating wave, the next pair occurs at the fundamental plus two times the modulating frequency, and at the fundamental minus two times the modulating frequency, and so on. The stronger the modulation is, the more of these sidebands occur. But wait a minute. There are two problems, one of which we have seen in the last clip. The other one we can easily come upon by calculating a couple of these sidebands. Problem 1. With a lower modulation strength, there seem to be no sidebands to the left of the fundamental. Problem 2. The lower sidebands bump against the 0 Hz border quite soon, mathematically. Negative frequencies? What a nonsense. How can oscillations have a frequency of, for example, minus something, minus 200 Hz or so? Oscillating less than not oscillating is sheer bullshit. Or shall I say Dadaism? Well, what happens is the following. Mathematically, negative frequencies in the real world are positive frequencies. Of course, positive, but with a phase shift of 180 degrees, meaning where a sine wave of, let's say, 250 Hz has its positive half wave, a sine wave of minus 250 Hz has its negative half wave. In the spectrum, it is as if the negative frequencies were mirrored along the y-axis. Ah, I hear you say, that's this through zero thing. Unfortunately, you are wrong. When we talk about through zero FM, we don't mean partials going through zero. We don't even directly talk about partials at all when we say through zero. What goes through zero are not partials, but the deviation of the modulated frequency. The wave, the modulated wave, not partials or spectrum. I'll explain that later in detail when I come to linear FM. Just be patient a bit. But stop. There's just another problem now. If the mirrored frequencies can fall against the originally positive frequencies, but with a phase shift of 180 degrees, then these frequencies should cancel each other out. But they don't, as we have seen and heard. How is that? The explanation is simple. The sidebands are not equally strong. Their amplitudes are not equally high. Yes, the mirrored sidebands dim the original positive ones, but don't completely cancel them out. At least most of the times they don't. There is a way to tell whether or not such a complete cancellation happens. The so-called Bessel functions help finding these situations, but this is really quite high mathematics. But for now, I have clear some more basic terms. I have to clear some more basic terms. First of all, let's call the modulated oscillator the carrier and the modulating oscillation the modulator. And now it's time for a kind of rule. And this rule reads: the C to M frequency relation determines which kinds of partials will occur. It's this simple carrier plus and minus modulator thing. And the strength of the modulation determines how far up and down the spectrum these partials really do occur. Only one term is to explain before we can leave this first part of theory in the video and start making sounds again. Why exponential frequency modulation? We have done only exponential FM so far. Why is it called exponential? Well, again, it's quite simple. The frequency deviation caused by exponential FM is symmetrical to the modulated frequency, like with linear frequency FM, meaning it goes up to the maximum positive deviation and down to the maximum negative deviation to the same amount of octaves, unlike linear FM. But as one octave up means double the frequency, the range which the deviation covers grows exponentially in frequencies. 1 octave down means half the frequency. If you take any number and divide it in half, and then you divide the divided number in half again and again and again, the numbers get smaller and smaller. But they never ever reach zero. Never. This is the reason why the term exponential through zero FM is absolutely nonsense. There is no exponential through zero FM. It is impossible. And another phenomenon is typical for exponential FM, and it's hereby explained. The pitch goes out of tune when I try to play a melody using a timbre created by exponential FM at a higher modulation strength. And why? Well, the average of the highest and the lowest frequency of the deviation changes the wider the range of the modulation is. Let's listen to it. And with that said and shown, we have killed the first theoretical part of this video and are back to more sounds and batching at last. What is the difference between the two identical exponential FM input jacks, FM1 and FM2, one on one hand, and the 1 volt per octave jack on the other hand? So, in what are these two FM1 and 2 jacks different from the 1 volt per octave jack? The answer is only the strength of modulation and the default value. FM1 and FM2 jacks are attached to circuits which need more than only 1 volt to cause a frequency deviation of 1 octave. Just another word about the 1 volt per octave jack and its attached potentiometer. You will have noticed that the middle position of this potentiometer is not 0 but 1. Well, that's the default value when you use this jack to make the Zeroscillator play notes, play a melody. 1 volt per octave times 1 equals 1 volt per octave. Sure. But by turning the poti knob to the left, I can change this characteristic to generate microtonal pitch developments. Or I can turn the knob to the right to make the module cover more than an octave per 1 volt CV, up to 2 octaves per 1 volt. I have set up a patch with 2 amplifiers and 2 envelopes. The right amplifier, modulated by the right envelope, shapes the volume, and the left amplifier and the left envelope, they shape the strength of modulation. The pitch comes from my DAW, as well as the gate signal, which activates both envelopes. Let me demonstrate a couple of envelopes for volume and for modulation strength. You will have noticed that the detuning when the modulation strength changes is wonderfully suitable when making percussive sounds. It makes them sound quite natural. We have been working with a carrier-to-modulator frequency relation of 1:1. The Zeroscillator and the external oscillator have been running at the same frequency. Let me change this now. I choose integer relations at first, then non-integer ones. Let's go. I have been dealing with sine waves so far, only with sine waves, but the Zeroscillator has more wave shapes on offer. Let's do some investigations and experiments, even with these shapes now. First thing to find out is if there is a difference between, for example, sine modulates saw on one hand, and on the other, saw modulates sine. And we see there is a difference. We have to look at and listen to all of these 48 combinations, therefore. Let me demonstrate these combinations without a lot of words now. I use the same frequency for carrier and modulator. The C to M carrier to modulator relation is 1:1. And I'm not going to use envelope modulations for volume and modulation strength, not even using envelopes at all. Otherwise, this video would last days instead of hours. But I am going to show some very special patches after the following basic demonstrations. There are some interesting questions which have to be answered. The first of which reads, does it make a difference when I exchange carrier and modulator? I have asked this question before. Let me try it with the combinations sine wave modulates triangle versus triangle modulates sine wave. Well, it makes a difference with the Zeroscillator. When the wave with the less complex spectrum modulates the wave with a more complex spectrum, the resulting spectrum is more complex than the other way around. Or in carrier-modulator words, when the carrier spectrum is more complex than the modulator spectrum, then the resulting wave is more complex than the other way around. Let me prove this only once more. I use triangle and square this time. Well, it's proved. Next question. When I moved through all the carrier-modulator combinations, we could see and hear that pulse waves with a very short duty cycle and pulse waves with a very long duty cycle sound the same when modulated. But what if they are the modulator and not the carrier? Well, time for some explanations. Time for theory again, so let the horror continue. I have to talk about phase, about angles and degrees. Angels, not angels. And what all of this has to do with waves and frequencies. I'll use a sine wave for all of my examples at first. It's the easiest thing to understand when it comes to phase and waves and so on. Some of the graphics and all of the animations in this second theoretic part are taken from a website called GeoGebra. GeoGebra, I see. Well, okay, well. You'll find the link to it down in the description again. I had meant to use a real physical model with cardboard and drawing circles on moving sheets of paper, but my fine mechanical skills proved to be far too limited, so I let it be. If I tried to draw a perfect circle on a piece of paper with one hand while moving this piece of paper smoothly and regularly into one direction with the other hand, I would get a sine curve. The computer graphics can do it better than me. Every angle from 0 degrees to 360 degrees belongs to a certain point on the graph of the sine wave. At points which belong to the angles of 0 degrees and of 180 degrees and of 360 degrees, the amplitude of the wave is zero. Zero crossing, it's called. At the point belonging to an angle of 90 degrees, the amplitude is at its positive maximum, and at the point belonging to 270 degrees, the amplitude of the wave is at its negative maximum. This is the meaning of the phase angle of an oscillation. Instead of phase angle, we usually call it simply phase. A phase shift of 180 degrees means, for example, that the wave shifts from a certain positive amplitude value to the same amplitude value but negative. If we have two waves of phase shift of 180 degrees, they cancel each other out. When I do phase modulation, I attack the angle in the graphic, whereas with frequency modulation, I go for the speed of the dot on the circle. In a very, well, let's say simplified way, I can say PM, phase modulation, modulates the geometrical attribute, the angle, whereas FM, frequency modulation, modulates an aspect of physics, the speed. It's not the same, but in both cases the frequency is changed, gets modulated at the end of the day. The Zeroscillator does FM, frequency modulation. The famous DX series of Yamaha did PM, phase modulation, even if they called their synths FM synths, for what reason ever. The Zeroscillator does FM, as I said. Let's not talk about PM and the differences to FM on behalf of making sounds in this video, therefore. There's enough of theory to cover, even when I'm going to talk only about all kinds of FM frequency modulation. We saw and heard before that there's no difference between modulating a pulse wave which has a narrow positive pulse and one with a narrow negative pulse. But there is a huge difference between modulating any oscillation by a pulse wave with a narrow positive pulse or by one with a narrow negative pulse. So why is that? Let's have a detailed look at what's going on then. Please notice what's going on in the wave view window when I switch from narrow positive to narrow negative pulses. The frequency of the resulting wave changes. Well, of course it does. With short negative pulses, the modulating wave is most of the times at higher level. What means the carrier, the modulated wave, is most of the times at a higher average frequency. Please remember, we are in exponential FM, and when the frequency deviation is high, the average frequency is high as well. I explained this in the first part of theory. And with short positive pulses, it is the other way around. The frequency deviation is low most of the times, and so is the average frequency of the resulting wave. Let me explain another phenomenon which we observed while comparing different wave modulations. When we have two different wave shapes, one modulating the other, it makes a huge difference which one is the modulator and which one is the carrier. First of all, why should this be surprising? Well, let me change the terminology to one spectrum modulates the other one, which means each and every partial in spectrum 1 is modulated by each and every partial in spectrum 2. No matter which spectrum is the carrier and which one is the modulator, we always have the same carrier-modulator frequency pairs. So why does it nevertheless make a difference which of the two spectra acts as the carrier and which one is the modulator? There are two reasons. Well, Each and every partial of one of the spectra modulates each and every partial in the other spectrum, but not at the same strength. Partials further away from the fundamental are usually weaker and cause lower frequency deviations. When the less complex spectrum is the modulator and the more complex spectrum is the carrier, then all partials in the carrier spectrum are modulated quite strongly. Their frequency deviation is quite large. But when the modulator is the one with the more complex spectrum, and the carrier is the simple one, then the few partials in the carrier's spectrum are modulated strongly only by the first upper partials of the modulator's spectrum. The other, higher partials, don't cause such huge frequency deviation. The resulting spectrum is less complex, as is the carrier's. The second reason is pure mathematics. Pure mathematics. The resulting spectrum is calculated by the formula carrier frequency plus and minus modulator frequency, and carrier frequency plus and minus double the modulator frequency, and so on. But in modulators with complex spectrum, these double the modulator's frequencies and 3 times the modulator's frequencies and so on get very high quite fast for the upper partials in the modulator spectrum. And the higher, the weaker. Again, weaker. And most of these multiplications reach and cross the border of audibility of high frequencies completely. All right, enough of theory again for this part. Fans of horror may be calm. There are going to be more theory parts in this video. Let me introduce a nice little patch to you, just to end with the matter of exponential frequency modulation. I used two envelopes in the last batch. One to modulate the strength of the frequency modulation, the other one to modulate the overall volume. But in this batch here, I have added a third envelope and an LFO. The LFO modulates the carrier to modulator frequency relation, the C to M frequency relation, and the third envelope sends its signal from its inverse input directly to the second exponential FM input of the Zeroscillator. Enjoy it and play around with the patch a bit to get a feeling of how the different parameters work. Well, time to jump to the other side of the Zeroscillator, to linear frequency modulation. The upper linear FM in-jack is equipped with an attenuverter which sets the strength and the phase of the modulation, and at its 12 o'clock position the modulation strength is 0. Between plus and minus there is a phase shift of 180 degrees, which with only this jack attenuverter combination working, we don't perceive that. Plus maximum and minus maximum look and sound the same. But I'm going to demonstrate and prove the phase shift in a minute or two. Please notice that the little switch below the range knob is switched to typical, which means the Zeroscillator does not do the so-called through zero FM. I'm going to talk about that later in detail. The two jacks below, called FM index plus attenuverter and modulator, belong together. The modulator jack is the equivalent to the linear FM jack. Here the modulating signal is fed in. The strength of the modulation depends on the CV, which is fed in the FM index jack, whose attenuverter determines how much the incoming CV modulates this modulation strength and in which direction. In other words, the FM index jack plus attenuverter team, these two team up, they takes over the function of the aforementioned attenuverter of the linear FM knob. The POTI labeled initial index sets an offset to the modulation strength that is added to the modulation strength according to the FM index plus attenuverter combi. Let me play around with this functionality a bit to make it even clearer. You see, if the attenuverter, which is attached to the FM index jack, is set to 0, even the initial index POTI doesn't help getting some modulation. A modulating signal which is additionally fed in the upper jack, the one labeled linear FM, is added to the modulating signal fed in the modulator jack. To make it absolutely clear, signals fed into the modulator jack lead to linear FM too, even if it's not called linear modulator. I have not talked about the jack labeled mod out so far, this jack left of the wave shape outputs. Let me do so now. This output jack delivers the sum of all modulating signals according to the input jack's linear FM, modulator, and FM index. And there are two attenuverters, of course. Let me demonstrate this. Of course, we can use this combined modulator signal to modulate even something else than the Zeroscillator. But we can also use it directly as a sound source, like in this patch here, where the combined modulator signal is fed into the right audio channel and the modulated signal is fed into the left one. Both audio signals are patched through a different VCA envelope combination. Well, back to a simpler patch. Just linear FM sine wave modulates sine wave. But now I switch from typical to through zero and get a completely different spectrum, a completely different sound. And the red LED starts suddenly blinking. This red LED is always lit when the wave goes through zero, whatever the meaning of this term may be. Explanation in a minute or two. When I turn down the strength of the modulation, the red LED stays unlit, and there is no difference between typical linear FM and through zero linear FM. Just one more demonstration before I'll shock you with theory and explanations again. I return to the patch from a minute ago and demonstrate the different sounds of typical FM and through zero FM in different frequency ranges. But now it's really time for explanations and gruesome theory again. I owe you the proof that the plus and minus labels really mean a phase shift of 180 degrees. Well, here it is. I patch one and the same modulation into the linear FM jack with its attenuverter turned to plus maximum and into the modulator jack with the FM index attenuverter turned to its minus maximum. The modulation vanishes and the signal at the mod out jack is cancelled out. The modulating signal and the result of the modulation are shown in different colors in the signal analyzer. Okay, what is linear FM? You will already have guessed it from my explanations of exponential FM. The frequency deviation goes up and down by the same amount of hertz, not of octaves. This means the lowest frequency and the highest frequency are equally far away from the frequency of the unmodulated wave, the original frequency, which is indeed still the center frequency. Does this mean we don't have to deal with the detune effect that we met with exponential FM? Well, as long as the modulation strength, the modulation index, doesn't cross a certain border, there is there is no detune effect. But once having crossed this border, detuning sets in again. But why? Well, we are still using typical linear FM, not through zero FM. And imagine a carrier of, let's say, 250 Hertz, being modulated that strong that the frequency deviation is, let's say, 400 Hertz. In this case, the frequency goes up to 650 Hertz and down to, zero Hertz, because there is nothing like 250 minus 400, which would equal to minus 150 Hertz. And we get an average frequency of 0 to 650 divided by 2, what is 325 Hertz. The pitch goes up from the previous and original 250 Hertz to these 325 Hertz. I have not talked about two certain phenomena in the spectrum of the modulated wave so far. Two phenomena which may have left you uneasy a bit. With both kinds of frequency modulation, linear as well as exponential, there are some partials in the spectrum which should not be there according to the rules of FM. These partials occur when the modulation strength crosses the border of stable tuning and our detune effect sets in. And what's even worse, all the frequencies which should be in the spectrum vanish. It looks as if they were torn apart in two different frequencies, one of which lower than the regular one, the other higher. So, what is going on here? The first hint is given to us by the fact that these strange partials and the effect of vanishing originals occur at the same strength of modulation at which the detuning sets in. May it be the border of 0 Hertz which is playing a trick on us here? The second hint and the proof of our suspicion is given to us when anticipating my next measure a bit, when I switch from typical to through zero FM. All the strange phenomena vanish again. Let me solve the mystery of the strange and irregular lowest partial in the spectrum. I have adjusted the carrier frequency to exactly 250 Hertz. Now I crank up the modulation strength and measure the frequency of this misbehaving lowest partial. The frequency is quite exactly 90 Hertz. Now I measure the frequencies of the two partials which were born by the lowest regular partial by these 250 Hertz and discover that they are quite exactly 250 Hertz minus 90 Hertz and 250 Hertz plus. Amen. That looks pretty much like ring modulation, doesn't it? And the more I crank up the modulation strength, the higher rises this strange lowest partial, and rises the same way as the twin partials born by my 250 Hz walk away from their mother. It looks like all partials in the regular spectrum are ring modulated by this lowest newly appearing frequency, but is it really so? And where does this alien frequency come from? Before I solve this riddle and answer these two questions, you might need a quick recapitulation what ring modulation is. Ring modulation is a certain kind of amplitude modulation. We get a tremolo when the modulating frequency is in sub-audio range, but when the modulating frequency reaches audible frequencies, then new partials occur in the spectrum, which are at frequencies lower and higher than the modulated partials, lower and higher by the same amount, lower and higher by the modulating frequency. Bang! That's it. That's what we see here. But how is the amplitude of the carrier modulated? The Zeroscillator does frequency modulation, not amplitude modulation. To find out, I remove the second Zeroscillator, the modulator, and replace it by an LFO to see what really happens with our poor carrier when it is frequency modulated and painfully bumps against the border of 0 Hz. And we see all goes silent at 0 Hz until the modulation lets it go up again and return from the realm of negative numbers. And here we are. The sound is regularly and continuously switched on and off. That's amplitude modulation, a quite harsh and strict kind of, because the amplitude is not only changed from higher to lower and so on, but from maximum high to totally 0. Anyway, we are, let me say it like that, we are at home with our explanations and understanding of this phenomenon now. Are we? Really? If I did a whole bunch of experiments and measurements like the one I have done during the last minutes, we would discover that these irregular partials, which aren't really irregular anymore now that we understand them, well, that these partials are not always that well behaved like in my last examples. They are quite a bit away from the places they should be in the spectrum, not very far, but remarkably far sometimes. The reason is the symmetry, or better said, the missing symmetry of the amplitude modulation. According to the strength of the frequency modulation and the basic frequency of the carrier, the times of silence are equally long as the times of audible sound, or they are shorter, or they are longer than the times of audible sound. And in the last two mentioned cases, the amplitude is not modulated in a square wave-like shape of sound on, sound off, but in a pulse wave-like manner, understandably leading to different mathematical relations. But the principle still fits. Hooray! We have reached the end of this part of theory, but there are more to come in this video, and and we can do a bit of patching and exploring the Zeroscillator again. Let's make some noise. Let's make some noise now. I insert a spring reverb to make it all a bit more interesting and switch from typical 2 through 0 FM. Or everything a bit nicer and without index modulation. or a bit of percussion with a slightly detuning of modulator and carrier. But how? But how does this through zero FM work? What is it? Is it something like the mirrored partials, which we met a good while ago? Is it again this 180 degrees phase shift? Is it simply changing plus to minus? Well, it's your fault. It's really your fault. You are asking yourself these questions. I know it. It's your fault that it's again time for theory. But only a short part of theory this time. To answer the last three of the just mentioned questions, no, no, and no. It is nothing like these mirrored partials. Not a part of the spectrum goes through zero, but the wave itself, the whole wave. And it is not a 180 degrees phase shift. It may look like one sometimes, depending on at which point of the wave, at which phase angle, the wave is at the moment when it bumps against 0 Hertz, but it is not. And it is no changing between plus and minus at all. But, well, what is it then? What happens to the wave when its frequency deviation lets it get mathematically to a negative frequency? Some educators say the wave goes back in time. Well, that is misleading a bit. Nothing goes back in time. Thermodynamics has proved that, and please let alone quantum physics here. I prefer a slightly more complex explanation and say the amplitude of the wave returns to those values where it had been before the wave's frequency got 0. It reproduces its amplitude development from the past like it looks from the present. It's kind of looking back, not going back. Let me demonstrate that and demonstrate my masterly skills with pencils, brushes, and paper. Well, let's say the modulation is strong enough. We have a modulation, frequency modulation here, that's strong enough to drive the lower part of the deviation, frequency deviation below 0. So what happens? Let's start with a certain frequency. So, and the frequency gets lower and lower and lower and lower. And let's say here we had a frequency of 0. Let me mark this. So with usual frequency modulation, the amplitude of the wave would stay at this level for a certain time, and we would have silence. But through 0, the following things happen. The amplitude of the wave develops according to what has happened or what had happened before, but seen from this point of 0, from this 0 line. So it goes up, and every point, or each of these points corresponds to each other. It's like a mirror. The 0 line, the 0 Hertz line is like a mirror, and then it goes down, then it goes up again and gets faster again, and. So we are here in mathematically 0 frequencies, but then the modulation, according to the modulation, the frequency goes up again, as we see, and then it goes down again. I need more space here. Let's make it faster. It goes down again. And reaches 0, again 0, but this time from the minus, mathematically minus area. Let me make the sign here. We have 0 Hertz, 0 Hertz, 0 Hertz. And then the same thing happens again. The frequency goes up, then the amplitude, sorry, not the frequency. The amplitude goes down, and the development is the same. We don't have a phase, we have a kind of phase shift, yes, but it's not 180 degrees. It would be 180 degrees if, let me use the red one, if, sorry, the wave would reach 0 Hertz, the frequency of 0 Hertz, at its 0 amplitude crossing. Then, as you see, it would go down here and up here, completely opposite to what was before. Completely opposite, not only talking about the direction is here completely opposite. Here it goes up, and here it goes down, here it goes down, here it goes up, is completely opposite, but not the amplitude. All right, back to the Zeroscillator. It won't be necessary to talk about the tuning knob, the fine-tune knob, or the range knob, I think. But you might have not noticed this nice little quantize switch next to the tuning knob. In its upper position, this switch makes the tuning knob jump in chromatic steps of halftones instead of continuously and seamlessly changing the frequency. But this quantization works only on the big tuning knob, not on fine-tune and not on the 1 volt per octave input jack. We have to talk about the bias knob, whose function is not altogether clear at once. In simple words, the bias knob sets the frequency the Zeroscillator is running at when no kind of modulation is initiated. With nothing patched into the Zeroscillator and the bias knob set to zero, the modulator runs at 0 Hertz, what is silence, no running at all. Even the tuning knobs won't help then. And even patching a modulating signal in the exponential FM jacks will not rouse the machine. Even a modulated 0 is still a 0. But when I use the linear FM jacks, the Zeroscillator suddenly comes to life again in both modes, typical as well as through zero. Well, we know linear FM can deal with zeros, as we have seen in the previous theory parts. Just a little speciality. If we modulate the pulse width of the square wave, we also get sound out of the Zeroscillator set to a bias of 0. But back to the bias knob and linear FM. What do the different positions of the bias knob mean? How do they change the behavior of the Zeroscillator? With no modulation going on, they don't seem to have any influence as long as the bias is not at 0. And even exponential FM doesn't seem to be impressed when I turn the bias knob from 1 to 4 and back to 1. But with linear FM, things become different. The sound and the spectrum change with through zero FM and even more dramatically with typical linear FM. The lower the bias settings are, the more partials are in the resulting sound, which gets more and more complex the lower the bias settings are. Okay, it needs only a bit of thinking to understand this effect. The lower the bias is, meaning the nearer the unmodulated, let me say natural frequency of the Zeroscillator is to 0 Hz, the less modulation strength is needed to make the linearly modulated frequency bump against 0 or even go through 0. With high bias, let's say of 4, and a low modulation strength, 0 Hz isn't reached at all. Watch the red LED to prove that. It's as simple as that. The pulse width knob and its assigned CV jack with attenuverter won't need any further explanation. Let me only say that the pulse width modulation functionality doesn't concern the morph functions, which I am going to talk about in a minute. Above the linear FM jacks, there is an input plus attenuverter labeled Vari-Synch. You may think it's the well-known oscillator sync functionality. Well, you know, this master and slave thing. But it is not, or better said, it is very special. It's a kind of unpredictable oscillator sync. This function simulates more a broken circuit, and the attenuverter does its very best to mimic a potentiometer with one of its pins being badly soldered to a PCB. Even only removing the plug and patching it in again without changing the attenuverter, the value of the attenuverter, can change the sonic result often enough. You catch the Zeroscillator at different phases of its cycle. The time reversal jack at the bottom of the GUI does exactly what its name suggests. It forces the wave's amplitude development to reverse its direction as if its frequency would have gone through zero. Let me demonstrate this with a saw wave, time reversed by a square wave of about half the frequency. The green line is the modulating square wave, the blue one is the wave coming from the Zeroscillator. When I patch the square wave in the time reversal jack, we see that with every beginning cycle of the square wave, every jump to the maximum position, a positive level, the Zeroscillator's saw wave is forced to reverse its development. Let me demonstrate different frequency relations between the master oscillator on the left side and the Zeroscillator. I'll call it the slave. And now, silently like a snake, and soundlessly like a cat, but in the end, again with Bang! Theory steps in again. So, is it frequency modulation then? No, it isn't. The frequency of the output wave is stable and doesn't change. Okay. Is it oscillator sync then, eventually Hardsync? No, it isn't. The Zeroscillator's wave doesn't always begin anew from the beginning or from its beginning, or the beginning of its cycle, when the master oscillator, our green one, forces it to change. Is it eventually phase modulation then? No, it isn't. Even with phase modulation, the frequency would constantly change, as I told you in the first theory part. Or is it phase distortion synthesis at least? Don't be kidding. Well, there is only one little single aspect which makes it look like phase distortion sometimes, but it is not at all phase distortion synthesis. I'm going to discuss another voltage modular module in the future, which really does do phase distortion. There you'll see and hear and eventually understand what phase distortion is and how it works. Let me surprise you. Just subscribe with the bell on and visit my website from time to time, not miss this video, this future one. So, what is it? Well, it's simple what I have said. The wave stops going on continuously and jumps into changing its hitherto amplitude development into the opposite direction. The sound has some similarities with oscillator Hardsync, though. Let me just point out some aspects of this time reverse technique that helps designing a certain wanted sound. If the master oscillator, the green one on the left, and the slave oscillator, the Zeroscillator here, are running at the same frequency but are not in phase, we get some nice beats in the sound whose strength depends on the account of phase shift between master and slave. If this amount is big enough, it can lead to creating new kinds of cycles in the resulting wave, which then leads to different pitches. The Zeroscillator's ramp waves get wonderfully clean triangle waves quite often, and again it depends on where in the Zeroscillator's cycle the time reversal signal arrives. And the pitch of the resulting wave is the pitch of the master quite often, but not always. With real oscillator Hardsync, it's always the master. All right. All right. Let's say goodbye to theory again and hello to the morph functionality of the Zeroscillator now. Each of the two morph sections offers triangle, sine, or square wave shapes and anything between these shapes. The spectrum in the upper signal analyzer depicts the smooth and seamless morphing process more in detail than the wave shape display below. Each of the two morph sections offer its current wave shape in two versions with a phase shift of 180 degrees. Using the CV input below the wave shape potentiometer, we can automate the morphing process. In the operating manual, a nice stereo effect is mentioned. We get this effect by using both morph sections and modulate them with the same signal but at opposite direction settings of the attenuverters. First of all, thank you for watching. And because you've watched my video until here, until its end, it seems you have liked it. I'm happy about that. No, I'm happy but blah blah blah. I'm really happy. No but. And if you subscribe and like, I'm glad too. Again, no but I'm really happy about that. I give private language lessons here at home in the Czech Republic, well, and mathematics and physics and even philosophy. That's one way to make my living. And I write ebooks about working with sound and making music, and I produce non-public videos about these matters. That's the second way I make my living. I have to confront you with the cruel reality now. If the earnings from my sound works are sufficiently high to ensure my biological existence, there will be a lot less lessons and a lot more videos and ebooks. A lot more working with sound you can hear and see. If not, then there will be more lessons at home and less videos and less ebooks and less soundworks. That's life. You can support me. You can support me by just buying me a coffee, see the donate link down in the descriptions, or by visiting the shop at my website and buying a video or an ebook. Or you can even become a member of our Raw Film community and get everything in the shop for free. Absolutely everything. Even new future productions, as long as your membership lasts. There is a membership page at my website in case you wanted to learn more about that matter. Thank you very much indeed. Enjoy your day. Your Rolf Kasten.